My preferred UI method is first preference through raising your hand in the Zoom reaction. Second preference is through chat. I'll prioritize closing if there is any. No preferred gender pronoun. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, exactly the problem is what OG wants to champion. The problem exactly is the culture of smoking is disproportionate uniquely to Indonesia. Notice that Indonesia has one of the highest usage of tobacco. Notice that Indonesia uniquely has a disproportionately high culture of smoking comparison to other nations. Panel. This is exactly the culture that Sri Mulyani wants to mitigate, and that's we think a decision that is worth justifiable from the perspective of the governments, right? So in this speech, I'm going to talk about several things. The first thing I just want to do is rebut their idea about the problem why high taxation is bad, because it comes at the expense of lower salary jobs. Firstly, panel notice that in status quo, the companies who are providing tobacco demands for the market are not small companies, but they are huge companies with lots of revenues, lots of big branches, for example. And these are substantial companies that the government taxes them a lot, right? Given that the size of these companies are so huge, it is very unlikely for them to act like a small company and do things like unrational contract violations, for example. It is unfeasible then for a big company like Jarum, for example, to actively compromise the acts of what opening government says, like reducing the salaries and whatsoever. Even if there is some pay cuts, for example, it comes at the momentum of COVID pandemic, where a lot of white collar jobs is laid off anyway, but that's because of an external factor that influences demand, right? So this is not something that is A, exclusive to the tobacco industry within the current context, or B, it is still something that's not as significant. But C, even if it is not a problem from Sri Mulyani's decision. It is the problem of accountability from the government. It is a problem of good governance. It is a problem of criminal justice system. And both sides agree that those things are outside of the debate, I think. Where Sri Mulyani's decision does matter, though, is how society views smoking and why the revenue from the tobacco industry interacts with a lot of other ministries. And that's my second point. My first argument regarding why this is a good strategy for the state of Indonesia to create a better healthcare system and to create a better synergy between the other ministries. Firstly, this is a form of synergy between the other ministries. Because notice that when Sri Mulyani decides to put a heavy taxation, it is not in the vacuum of other ministries, but it is also something that is interacting and influencing of each other. For example, in Sri Mulyani's Ministry of Finance, for example, this is a decision that is also congruent with the interest of the Ministry of Health, for example. The fact that they are taxing lots of tobacco industry means that there is a huge capital that is now being able to be transferred to a lot of other ministries. And this is why the synergy between these ministries are important, panel. Why is there synergy? And why is the interest mutually beneficial for all of these ministries? Firstly, because when you tax these sort of industries, you reduce the amount of smoke and the amount of tobacco excess that exists. But secondly, it also reduces health costs to the nations. And this is actually important, because if you look at the scale of the smoking that exists in Indonesia, the health cost of a lot less people doing smoke is actually pretty huge, panel. This is why the cooperation with Ministry of Health and other ministries to allocate proper funding is an important momentum that Sri Mulyani strategically takes. This is a form of reparation so that they are able to have allocations of funding that is able to be allocated to other means. So, for example, the tax that the tobacco industry creates, it is something that is able to be allocated for the Ministry of Health, and therefore to create a compensation for the high smoke and for the health cost that rises from the smoking culture. It is able to be compensated with the rigorous fundings that is able to be funneled through the healthcare system, through the environmental reparations, for example. What exists on government side? You enhance the more people are able to smoke, but at what expense? At the expense of, sorry, no audio. At the expense of at the expense of the environment, at the expense of health costs, and the cost of that is huge given the scale of impact that we are talking about. Actually, I'll take CG now.
If it is true that there's no alternative of taxation, meaning that government is the one that have bad budget allocation and management and calculations.
Okay, so if government, okay, firstly, no, government is filled with researches that is rational and whatsoever. But secondly, I think it's the basic logic of taxation that the more you provide, the more you the more you get, the more tax that is able for the state to capture, because tobacco is the most profitable sectors in for the last 5 years. It is fair that the tax generated from them is also the highest, and that's why the tax is proportional. And that's actually the third reason why the tax is still going to be proportional on our side panel. Because notice that even if with Sri Mulyani's current decision, the tobacco industry is still one of the largest in the world. The people doing smoking and buying cigarettes, for example, is still one of the highest usage in the world. So given all of the plans that I just said, it is not an inconsistency, but it is a trade-off that is justified, right? Because when you take these cigarettes, you need to have the allocated funding, and that funding goes through the tax. So on government side of the house, that is when the proportionality happens, because there is no reallocation of funding. That's a crucial problem that they need to address. But thirdly, why does poor people not smoking is a benefit panel? Firstly, I think the idea of consent and the idea of freedom that you have ought to be restricted, especially in regards to smoking. That idea of consent and that idea of freedom comes at the expense of other things like the environment, like the health of the people around you who may not consent. So that's why the restriction of consent is still justified. But secondly, poor people not smoking is a benefit for themselves, because a lot of people suffer from nicotine addiction, for example, striking at the most vulnerable people. Exactly, this culture is unproportionate when it is not tax panel. The best way to mitigate that and the best way to help the governmental systems cooperate at its maximum function is exactly through taxation. Proud to oppose.